And we will begin. So, on behalf of the Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute, we are very happy today to have with us Professor Laura Arnold Leibman, who is the Leonard J. Milberg 53 Professor in American Jewish Studies at Princeton University. And what a wonderful way to close out the Jewish American History Month with a professor in American Jewish Studies. Her work focuses on religion and the daily lives of women and children in early America and uses everyday objects to help bring their stories back to life. And just a little thing, if you follow her on Facebook, you'll see some amazing textiles. So I just want to put that out there as well. Today we're going to be talking about her book, Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family. That is only one of her publications. I encourage you to continue to research it. And Laura, if you want to add anything to what I've been saying, you can introduce yourself much better than I can. I can just say that I'm a big fan. And last week, your name came up as encouraging as many people to come as possible because slaves came up and the slaves and the Jews. And so today was kind of introduced last week. So we're excited to see it. I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Leibman, and I'm here in the background following along.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I'm sharing screen because, as was mentioned, I work on objects, so I'd like to have a lot of images with my presentations. You can feel free to put things in the chat as we're going along, and feel free to interrupt me if you feel like there's a key question that needs to get addressed before we continue on, or we'll wait and do them at the end. But thank you everybody for coming for today, and let's go ahead and get started. So this is a book that took forever to write. I feel like people are always thinking books just pop out of nowhere, but this book took about 10 years to research and write, in part because it was so difficult to find the sources. And it's really a story about a pair of siblings who are Sephardic, Sarah Brandon Moses and Isaac Lopez Brandon, who began their lives poor, Christian, and enslaved on the island of Barbados at the end of the 18th century. But by the time that they had passed away in the 19th century, had become some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. And both of them, when they lived in New York, had been re-racialized as being white. What I'm going to talk to you about today, I hope we'll have three main takeaways by the end of it. One really is just something that you'll learn about these two individuals, that I feel they're a great example of how sometimes the people who in their own lifetimes are not necessarily the most famous people in their families can lead really extraordinary and fascinating lives. And I think in that sense can be an important inspiration for people doing family histories when they're looking at people who may not seem to be super illustrious at the time when they were living, and yet can really help us understand the course of history. The second thing that I hope people will take away has to do with something about race during this time period at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. You'll notice that I had said that they had began their lives enslaved, and they were, at the time of their birth in their young adult years, designated as being people of color. But by the time that they died in New York, they had been recategorized as white. A lot of times stories like this are talked about under the guise of passing, that somebody just leaves their past behind and nobody knows about it, and they're able to sort of dupe people into thinking that they're a different race. And that's really not the story that I wanted to tell with these two individuals, because every place that they went around the Atlantic world, people knew about their early history of being enslaved and about their African ancestry. And nonetheless, they still were recategorized as being white when they lived in New York. So for me, this really helps get at the ways in which race is functioning in a different way during this time period, particularly for Jews who, because of the connections that they have in different communities and different port towns, really don't have that possibility of just leaving their past behind. And for me, this is a story which both illuminates the sort of fragileness or the ways in which that there's some fluidity with race during this time period, but only for people who have a certain amount of wealth and ability to travel and who are racially ambiguous. So I both want to get at like what's unique about them and what it points to as larger discussions about race. So that's the second thing, something about race during this time period. And the third thing that I hope people will take away from the presentation has to do with this larger history of multiracial Jews. A lot of times people have talked about multiracial Jews in the history of the United States and the Americas as being something that happens relatively recently. So many scholars have focused on the history of multiracial Jews after, say, 1970. And I really hope that today's story will help people see that there's a much longer and more complicated history about the contributions of multiracial Jews to American Jewish history. So, with those three things in mind, something about people who are maybe not illustrious in their own eras, something about race, and something about multiracial Jews in the back of our minds, let's go ahead and start with the story about Sarah Brandon Moses and Isaac Lopez Brandon. Their story starts, as I mentioned, in the southeastern part of the Caribbean on the island of Barbados. And they were born at the end of the 18th century as the son of one of the wealthiest Sephardic merchants on the island, a man named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And their mother, although she had the last name Lopez, was not born genetically into the Lopez family, but rather as somebody who had been enslaved to the Lopez family. So I think really important to know they aren't born enslaved to their father, they're born enslaved to the Lopez family that their mother had been enslaved to. And their father, in addition to being a merchant, owned several plantations along the western coast of the island, but that wasn't where Sarah and Isaac or their mother were born or lived. In fact, they lived in the main port town of Bridgetown, which is in the southern part of the island. And they lived along a street called Swan Street. And if you could see sort of underneath here, if you squint really well, you can see it says or Jew Street. And that's because it was a big merchant street and still is today in the island. And at this time, it was a place where a lot of the Jews living on the island lived, in part because it was so close to the local synagogue. And in fact, both their father as well as the people who had enslaved the siblings and their mother were members of the Nida Israel synagogue, the main synagogue on the island during this time period. And in fact, at various points in his life, their father had not only been a member of the synagogue, but was the parnas, or president of it. So he's really a key player in synagogue life. The siblings, however, in spite of having a father who was very wealthy by the end of his life, grew up in a really sort of middling Sephardic family. And the people who had enslaved them were not, they were merchants, but they weren't like merchants who owned huge ships and moved things across oceans, but rather a family that owned a couple of small stores along Swan Street where the family would have lived upstairs in one of these apartments with a balcony overlooking the stores below. One of the children in the family was a silversmith and goldsmith. This is a ring that was made by Meyer Myers, who's a silversmith in New York. And he was probably not quite as impressive as Meyer Myers, but he's somebody who's making a lot of jewelry and whatnot in the island. And the other sibling was somebody who owned a every goods store on the island. After Sarah was born, she was taken by her mother to the nearby church, now cathedral, called St. Michael's Church, where she was baptized and entered into the records. And this is a really key moment in Sarah's life. Her mother couldn't, or her father couldn't take her to the synagogue because her mother hadn't been born halakhically Jewish, that is Jewish according to Jewish law. So Sarah at her birth was not either. And there wasn't a lot of conversions that happened to Judaism on the island. but her mother made the choice to take her to the church, in part because it would offer her daughter some of the rights that the mother hadn't ever been able to have. So during this time period, being baptized into the church allowed women in particular a certain amount of protection, and that was really important for enslaved women. It also meant that someday Sarah could go on to be married at the church, which was something that her mother and her grandmother and her great grandmother weren't able to legally do during their lifetimes. At the same time, that desire to get certain rights for her daughter meant that she had to submit her to the island's notion of race. So as soon as she gets baptized, she gets entered into the records of the church and she gets marked down as being a person of color. And if she and her brother had stayed on the island for the rest of their lives, that never would have changed. In Barbados at the time, there was something similar to what we would call the one drop rule later in the United States, where anybody with any African ancestry was considered a person of color, and that wasn't something that could be changed regardless of how much money or how much status a person had. And the baptismal font where she was baptized is still in that cathedral today. So after she gets baptized, she and her brother live along Swan Street in the house of the people that enslaved them for the next couple of years until 1801, when two really surprising things happen that changed the course of their lives forever. The first one was that their mother's father, who was a white man, left their mother and their uncles a house along Back Church Street, which was near where the family had lived. And this was just incredibly unusual. For some reason, he had never legally married anybody, the sibling's grandfather. So he didn't have any legal children of his own, but he also decided not to leave his houses to his nieces, white nieces and nephews, which would have been the typical thing to happen on the island. So suddenly their mother goes from being somebody who's considered a piece of property herself to being somebody who owns property. And that just radically changes the opportunities that the family has. The location of that house also ended up being fairly important. And you can see sort of blurrily here, it says the old churchyard. It was right next to where there had been a church that had been destroyed by a hurricane, where later St. Mary's Church would be built. This was also an Anglican congregation, but it became the place where wealthy, free people of color attended services. So sort of by coincidence, by having this house along Back Church Street and suddenly becoming property owners, the family goes from not only being enslaved to being very close to the center of elite, free people of color society. The house also was near where very soon after they were born would be built the Methodist congregation. And this is a place where suddenly the methods I used for writing this history become really, really important. When I started writing this history, I was really determined to make sure that I was researching not just their Jewish line, but also their mother's ancestry and their mother's family's history on the island. And that ended off paying off in spades because through their mother, they were related to the most famous woman on the island at the time. And she was a woman who, during her own lifetime, was named Anne Gill, but sometimes went by the name Sarah Ann Gill. And she was the first female national hero of Barbados because she used the Methodist religion in order to gain not just religious, but civil rights for both free and enslaved people of color. So for me, this was a really good moment of understanding how the siblings had come to some of their political consciousness that would shape the rest of their lives. So just as their aunt had been agitating for civil rights on behalf of people of color who were Methodists on the island, we would later see that Isaac, her nephew, used Judaism in a very similar way. So just to give a quick overview of their genealogy, because one of the things I'm sure you've heard again and again that makes Sephardic history difficult is that people get named for living relatives. So everybody seems to have the same name in this family, and it becomes a little confusing. So here we have Sarah, the sister who was born in 1798, her brother who's born 6 years earlier in 1792. Their mother is this woman who goes by multiple names. Sometimes Sarah Esther Gill, sometimes Esther Gill, sometimes Sarah Esther Lopez. Fortunately, her father, George Gill, mentions in his will that she goes by all these different names. It's like one of those great gifts that somebody in the past gives to a historian. And this is their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And here's that very famous woman, Anne Jordan, who's one of the first national heroes of the island. So I think important to see here that I was able to trace not just Sarah Esther's mother, Jemima Lopez, but I actually found out her grandmother as well, a woman named Deborah Lopez. And Deborah, Jemima, Sarah, and all of these people who are in these gray boxes were born enslaved to the Lopez family. So I think you can really see that even though they're not a family with a lot of money, they're earning a lot of income as well as gaining a lot of wealth off of having enslaved that great grandmother of the siblings. And the siblings had two other sisters who died quite young and drop out of the records. So I had mentioned there was this white Anglican grandfather who left them the house. He left it both to Jemima Lopez, who he'd had these four children with, and he left another house to a woman named Joanna Gill, with whom he'd had two other children. And Christiana, who's a woman, or Christian Gill, and Anne Jordan were both very involved in the Methodist movement and agitating for civil rights. So that was the first thing that happened in 1801. Suddenly, the siblings, through the death of their white Anglican grandfather, their family ends up inheriting this house and having a new economic prospect. The second really radical thing that happened to them in 1801 was that their father took them back to St. Michael's Church. And this time he wasn't interested in baptizing them, but he had paid the Lopez family in order to have his children freed. And he also had to make a payment to the church in order to have his children emancipated. And again, this would just radically change the siblings' lives and set them apart from the vast majority of people who were enslaved on the island. So most people who were enslaved on the island would have to wait into general emancipation, which happened in 1834, and then there were 4 years of apprenticeship, and then finally in 1838, most people would be truly free on the island. Had that happened to the siblings, had their father not stepped in and decided to pay both the church and the previous owners to have his children freed, Sarah would have already been dead by the time that general emancipation happened. And all of her children that we're going to hear about would have been born enslaved. So, very different. Instead of being freed at 3 years old, she would have spent her entire life, and her children's lives would have been spent at the beginning being enslaved. Similarly, her brother Isaac, instead of being freed at the age of 9, would have had to wait until his 40s to become free. So, again, this is just something that happens to be very random a bit on some level, that their father decides to do this for them. It is very unusual and not something that typically happened on the island, whether the father was Jewish or Christian. So after they inherit the house and after they become free, they continue to live their lives along Swan Street and back Church Street, now living as part of this rather large community of people, of free people of color, many of whom have one foot in the synagogue, often because of having a relative who was a Jew. But by 1811, Isaac Lopez Brandon decides enough is enough. He doesn't want to live at the margins of the synagogue, but rather wants to become a member of the Jewish community. And in order to do that, he needed to leave the island. And to convert, he decides to go south to the colony of Suriname. Now, for many of you, Suriname might not be the most obvious place to go to convert to Judaism. So I'll back up a second and say, like, why go to Suriname? Well, during this time period, Suriname, as well as this little kind of peanut-shaped island called Curacao off the coast of Venezuela, had the two largest Jewish communities in all of America. So they had the best infrastructure, they were the wealthiest, they had the most people. And so they were the obvious places for people to go if they wanted to convert. But Suriname, of those two places, also had a different lore, which was that at least 50% of the community, by the time the siblings went there in 1811, had at least one African ancestor. So it was a much more inclusive community that was interested in bringing in people with Jewish ancestry into the synagogue. And the reason for that multiracial community at the time that they come doesn't have as much to do with the port town that they stayed in, which is Paramaribo, but downriver in a small town called Yoden Savannah or Jew Savannah, which was the first semi-autonomous Jewish town in the Americas. And one of the things that's interesting about that town is that they were trying to lead a Jewish life that was similar to the rules in the Bible. And so they were more interested in converting people who were enslaved into their community. But again, not everybody. So they tended to convert the people who had a Jewish father, just like Sarah and Isaac had. By the time that the siblings arrived in Suriname, most of that Jewish community had moved north up to Paramaribo to the main port. And in fact, there were so many Jews in this town that it had more synagogues than, for example, New York or Philadelphia or any of those kinds of places would have had at the time. So they had both an Ashkenazi synagogue and a Sephardic synagogue. And for a while, we'll see they actually had a special congregating place for Jews of color as well. So when the siblings decided to arrive, they went to the Sephardic synagogue, or as it would have been known at the time, the Portuguese synagogue. And that kind of makes sense because their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, was a Portuguese Jew. But even if he hadn't been a Portuguese Jew, this would have been the ideal place for them to convert because during this time period across the Americas, Portuguese Jews had a much higher status than Ashkenazi Jews, or what might have been called High German Jews during this time period. So, really, by converting at this congregation, they're entering into a more elite form of Judaism, or one that, even within Jewish communities, typically had more social cachet. And we'll see that that plays off in terms of the rest of their life stories, that ability to become Portuguese Jews. For some of you who've been to Israel, to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you may have seen the interior of the synagogue because it has been rented to that museum. And so you can sort of see what the interior looked like in absentia. And this is the congregation where they went to convert, and they went before the Ma'amad, and Isaac was given permission in order to become circumcised. And after getting circumcised, the two of them went to a little house in the synagogue yard, which more recently has been used for Kiddush and whatnot, but where there was a trap door that would have led down into these steps into what at the time was a ritual bath. Today it's dry, but at the time it would have been filled with water. They would have gone down the steps, not together, one at a time, immersed in the water, and then come back up. Now, halakhically, that is, according to Jewish law, part of the Jewish community. Sometimes I'll get asked, was that a good conversion for this time period? And I think this is where, again, that sense of why Suriname was a good place to convert is really important. During this time period, Jews in Amsterdam and London and Hamburg would have seen a conversion that happened in Suriname as being halakhically acceptable, as opposed to, say, when people got converted at New York or Philadelphia, which were seen as much sketchier places, just because the Jewish communities were a lot smaller and had fewer people who knew a lot of stuff and didn't have as good of a Beit Din and stuff like that. So yes, this was definitely a place that then for the rest of their lives, they were considered to be Jewish by the Jewish communities that they lived in. I had mentioned that there was another synagogue that was down the street, and that was the Ashkenazi synagogue. And this building today is where both parts of the community is rejoined. This was the original building, and they worshiped together. But at the time, it had been originally belonged to the Sephardic community, and when they'd sort of gotten overrun by Ashkenazi Jews coming in, they had sold it to the Ashkenazi community and had built that other synagogue around the corner. And during this time period, I think helpful to know, back to my statement about status, that if a member of the Sephardic community had married somebody from this congregation, they would have been demoted to a second class citizen within their own congregation. So this isn't anything according to Jewish law. You can just see that there's some like differences seen between the communities at the time. And in response to that, we get the Ashkenazi community sort of fighting back and saying, like, well, if one of our Jews marries one of your Jews, we're also going to devote them. So a kind of tensions between the two communities. But in both of those communities, there would have been also given a second class status to anybody who was considered to be a Jew of color by the colonial government, or a person of color by the colonial government. And you'll remember that I'd said that about half of the community had at least one African ancestor, but only about 10% of the community at the time would have been considered a person of color. And that seems like, wait, there's a disconnect there. In Barbados, if you had any African ancestry, you would have been considered a person of color, but not so in Suriname. In Suriname, if you had 7 out of your 8 great grandparents were from Europe, you could either be racialized as a person of color or as somebody who was white. And that difference was based on whether your parents had a legal religious marriage. So if your parents had been legally married, then you would be white. If they weren't, you would be a person of color. If your parents legally married after you were born, your race would change from being a person of color to being white. So because of this, the community developed an innovation in Jewish practice, which again was not something that was according to Jewish law, where they wrote into their marriage contracts if somebody was considered to be a person of color in the larger colonial sphere. And the way that they did this was very interesting, that they, instead of racializing the person as being a Cushite or another biblical term that we might have seen in some of the other Hebrew documents from the colonies, they put that the person was an emancipated Jew. So they aren't thinking of the person as a different race. They're just marking that that person had a legacy with slavery. And again, that would be put in the marriage contracts, and then that would follow who the person was married to. So if somebody married into this community or was already a member of the Jews of color part of the community, they would have this second class status within the congregation, which meant they would be buried in the swampy part of the cemetery. They couldn't sit in the good seats in the synagogue, and they couldn't be called up to the Torah for honors. So again, not something according to Jewish law, but a way that we see Jews adapting to what's going on in the colonies and changing Jewish practice. I think this helps us understand a little bit, perhaps, of why the siblings were not interested in staying in Suriname, as well as some of the other things that were happening in the congregation that led up to the time when they were there. So I had mentioned that earlier there had been this brotherhood of Jews of color. So just like the siblings didn't seem very interested in this second class status, um, and we know that their parents didn't marry because at the time when they were in the colony, they were recorded by the government as being as being people of color, which indicates their parents weren't married. So prior to their arrival, there had been this group of Jews of color who were considered people of color by the government, who broke away from those two European-led Jewish congregations and started their own brotherhood called Darhei Yeshurim. And this was along Siva Plain, very nearby, and it was a place where Jews of color could have be called up to the Torah, where they could sit in the good seats, where they could be honored at their burials in the ways that everybody else was. And in the 1790s, this community had petitioned the colonial government to be recognized as a regular synagogue. And the European led congregations fought back and argued that they should not be allowed to be a separate congregation. And the colonial government sided with the European Jews. So by the time the siblings arrived, this community had been disbanded and people had had to rejoin those other two synagogues. So again, they have all these people who are in the community who have been agitating for civil rights, both men and women, who are inspirations for them, but also this history in Suriname of being both inclusive but setting up boundaries for Jews of color. So for me, this helps us understand why the siblings do not decide to stay and marry people in Suriname, but instead Isaac goes back to Barbados where he becomes involved in the civil rights fights on the island from the Jewish community's perspective. And I'm not going to talk more about that right now, but feel free to ask me about it in the question and answer. And it's something I talk a fair amount about in the book. His sister, who's still quite young at the time, she's only about 12, doesn't go back to Barbados, but instead, with the help of her father, goes on across the ocean to London, where her father is part of the Portuguese congregation Bevis Marks. And while Bevis Marks was in the East End of London, he doesn't actually have his daughter stay in the East End, but rather she goes slightly south of there to where she is enrolled in one of the elite Sephardic boarding schools for girls during this time period. And this is a place where she would have been uh, schoolmates with people from the Montefiore family and other really wealthy families from the Sephardic world. And for me, this training that she gets at this Sephardic boarding school is crucial to her ability to transition from being understood as being a person of color to being understood as white, because this is a place where not only would she have learned how to speak French like fancy people would do and to speak Portuguese and to be able to understand Hebrew, but where she would have learned how to govern a household and how to have servants and how to be somebody who was somebody in charge of servants as opposed to being a servant herself. And this really sets her up to be accepted within the Sephardic world that she will become part of for the rest of her life. And it's while she's in London that this beautiful little miniature of her gets made. So this miniature is only about this tall. They're very small, but these miniatures were really an important part of how people made contacts across different communities um, and met marriage partners. And in fact, also they were made in order to emphasize the whiteness of the person, that there was an emphasis on letting the beauty of the ivory go through. And you can see in a sort of close up of the brother's portrait how we don't even have any paint that's obscuring the whiteness of the ivory that's coming through in his portrait. And this contrasts really sharply between Sarah's portrait and other portraits of women, multiracial women from this time period, where the way that the artist is making her portrait, that he adheres the paint in a way that emphasizes her whiteness and the light color of her skin, as opposed to a lot of other portrait makers who did exactly what you weren't supposed to do with portrait making, which used this hatching motion to put on the darker paint, which ended up giving the women of color a sort of flawed look for their skin. So while she's in London, her portrait meets another portrait, which is that of a slightly older Jewish man named Isaac Moses. And they end up getting married at Congregation Bevis Marks. Now, sorry, not Isaac Moses, Joshua Moses. So Joshua Moses is a Jew who's there on business from New York, and his father, Isaac Moses, is the wealthiest Jew in New York at the time. And so I often think of this as being a marriage between the two fathers-in-law as much as between Joshua and Sarah. And that's because although both of their father-in-laws were quite wealthy, this really is a moment when Joshua is marrying up and bringing a lot of business back and forth for his father and his father-in-law. And had Sarah and Joshua tried to get married at Bevis Marks maybe 10 years earlier, they probably couldn't have, because at that time period, um, it it wouldn't have been that Sarah wasn't considered good enough, but Joshua wouldn't have been considered good enough because he was from an Ashkenazi family. So he's definitely socially benefiting from this particular marriage. In addition, Sarah's father has put a 10,000 pound dowry on Sarah's marriage, which is just a huge amount of money. So if there's any Jane Austen fans, you'll remember that Mr. Darcy is 10,000 pounds a year. This is almost exactly the same time period. And you may have wondered, is 10,000 pounds a lot of money? And the answer is yes, it is. It's about $30 million worth of purchasing money. So he not only is getting somebody who's super cute and adorable as a wife and much younger than him, but somebody who has a lot of business connections, brings an incredible dowry, and gives him that Sephardic ancestry that his and cachet that his family hasn't had. So after the siblings married, they briefly settle near the synagogue in London, but before the first year is out, they travel across the ocean back to New York, where Joshua's parents live, and they end up locating on the very tip of Manhattan near this Sherith Israel synagogue. This is where his parents lived. This is where Sarah and Joshua lived. And right after this, Isaac and the siblings' mother come north, leaving Barbados because after he is involved in this dispute for civil rights in Barbados, in order for Jews to get the civil rights, the Anglican government insists that they need to kick Isaac out of the voting membership so that he couldn't become a voting member on the island. And rather than fight back against the Anglicans, they demote Isaac and he abandons the community and comes north. And while he's in New York, he marries Joshua's sister. He ends up becoming business partners. They live right next to each other. And through his in laws' connections at Sherith Israel, he's put forward to become not only a member of the congregation, so a voting member of Sherith Israel, but also to become a naturalized citizen of the United States, something which somebody who was considered a person of color shouldn't have been able to do during this time period. And again, through those relationships, we see both Sarah and her husband being re-racialized as white. I think it's super important to note that, again, nobody is unclear during their time in New York about their prior ancestry. Both Sarah's husband, as well as some of the other members of the voting board of Sherith Israel, had gone to Talmud Torah with the grandson of their enslavers. So it's not like people don't know what's going on. Even when Sarah had married in London, one of the witnesses was somebody from Barbados. So again, people know, and yet in her marriage contract in London, there's no marking of her race. And similarly here, they're being accepted as members of the community, and that trumps other aspects of their identity. Really important to note that it's not that New York is some racial paradise during this time period. In fact, there are fairly racist members of the congregation who are writing sort of terrible things in the newspapers against African Americans. But for whatever reason, for them, the Portuguese ancestry as well as the Judaism of the siblings trumps those other aspects of their identity. So, as I mentioned, Sarah died quite young, before the age of 30, but not before she had had 10 children, because she has two sets of twins, 9 of whom lived to be adults. And some of those people become very illustrious members of the congregation, becoming the Parnas of the congregation. Others fight in the white militia, both in the Mexican-American War as well as in the Civil War. And one of her sons marries the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius, the most famous Hazan and most beloved Hazan of the congregation. So they really become central members of the congregation. And indeed, her sons end up spreading around not just the Atlantic world, but the globe, being involved in trade in ways that are really dependent upon that mobility of that previous generation. So not are they only involved in the Civil War and the War of 1848, they go off and try to make money in the gold rush. A couple of them try and overthrow the government in Nicaragua. And then three of them were off in Canton as well, involved in trade there. And so we're really seeing how that moment of that ability to transform themselves racially through that movement really transforms the lives of her children as well as herself. Importantly, for her brother, that racialization of white only happens when he's in New York. But in fact, when he goes back to Barbados in business, he's considered a person of color again. So I hope that through this conversation that you'll see again that idea that some of those people who maybe not have been super important during their own lifetimes, they were not the most famous members of their families, led really fascinating lives, that they give us this window into how race was functioning differently across different places in the Atlantic world, and how multiracial Jews, although often unacknowledged and even not known by their descendants before this book was written, um, were really important members of early congregations. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Sorry, I realized I did not unmute myself.
That's
So
okay.
thank you so much. I'll repeat that if you didn't read my lips. And thank you all for sending in some comments and questions. Continue to do so. I know there was a lot of information there, so it takes us a minute. I'm going to ask a somewhat quick question. Does the brother have children in Barbados?
Yeah. So super great question. Thank you, Aaron. That he actually has children both. Well, he has children who live in New York. So he marries much later than his sister, and he only has two children, one of whom dies very young. And his son, as soon as his father dies, marries the non-Jewish girl next door. So that part of the family passes out of Judaism pretty quickly. I had thought for a while that maybe he had children in Barbados because after his father's death, he goes back to Barbados to sort of settle up business there for a while. And he ends up having two people enslaved to him. And that had very much puzzled me. And so there was a young boy and a woman. And I'm like, why is he engaging in slavery? And as somebody who's escaped it himself, and also he seems to have struggled against it in terms of politics. One of the great joys of writing this book was to be able to connect with some of the descendants of that family, and through information of that boy, and through information um, with them to figure out who was that woman. And it turns out that woman was the wife of his half brother. So his father had had a son who had been enslaved much later through another woman, and whom he had freed. And this woman and her son had been enslaved to another family on the island. And during that period of apprenticeship, Isaac seems to have purchased them in order to keep them from being enslaved by other people when the family puts them up for sale. And this was actually very common during this time period. So Sarah and Isaac also inherited their great grandmother from the Lopez family when their enslaver passed away. So very common that people would try to protect family members by purchasing them in order to keep them from having to be working and whatnot. Um, so he didn't have a child in Barbados, even though I was sort of wondering whether he did. But it ended up being the person who was enslaved to him was a nephew. That part of the family ends up going off to Australia.
So one of the things I think you started to touch upon here is how some of these Jews could be involved in the slave trade in general. And it was, I'm not sure, it came up last week also, particularly if any of the rabbis had said anything against it to these communities. So.
Yeah, so there's definitely people in the United States of rabbis on both sides of the abolitionist debate. People who are pro-slavery, people who are anti-slavery. I have not seen people in Barbados picking up that same sort of rhetoric. So, but I think it does sort of get at the complexities of like what people are doing with slavery. So, I would take the paying of the people enslaving your children so that you could free them to be a different kind of purchasing of a person than trying to enslave somebody so that you can get financial benefit from them. And and I think it, again, super important to know that it was actually pretty common amongst free people of color in Barbados, particularly in Bridgetown, that they would have one of their relatives enslaved to them, again, as a way of protecting that person. So slavery is super complicated and really important to sort of dig down into the details of it.
But the Jews were involved in the state slave trade.
There are some Jews involved in the slave trade, particularly from Newport, Rhode Island. Yeah, so there's a couple of Jews involved in the slave trade. We don't have Jews involved in the slave trade that I know of from Barbados. Um, yeah, though um, that said, I think it depends on how you think about being involved in the slave trade. That um, the triangle trade, which involves like pe both bringing people into slavery and shipping people, but then also shipping goods north to be manufactured, taking them to Europe, and then using that money to buy enslaved people and move goods and people around. Pretty much everybody in the colonies on some level is benefiting, who's not enslaved, is benefiting from some aspect of that triangle trade. And Jews are often involved in other kinds of merchant activities that touch on the triangle trade, even if they aren't shipping people. There are only a few people in the colonies who will say, like, I refuse to use sugar because it comes from the labor of enslaved people. So
No,
it's a
there
pretty
were.
common thing that people are in some way benefiting from slavery.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
especially because it was so rampant, I think, at that point.
exactly. Yeah.
So Susanna brings up something interesting that the people in the pictures, and you noted also that they kind of kept it ivory white, the people, and yet you keep saying that they were categorized as being of color. So how did actual physical traits play into categorizing somebody of color?
Yeah. So again, in Barbados, the being a person of color didn't have to do with your skin tone. It had to do with your ancestry and whether you had any African ancestry. And somewhat similarly in Suriname as well, right? That being a person of color had to do with what percent of your ancestry was African, as well as whether your parents were legally married. So um, it's not this a skin tone sort of based understanding of race that we might think of as happening later in the United States. That said, I think it's really important to remember that those miniatures may be deceptive. So we definitely have miniatures of the father as well as oil paintings of him, and his skin tone is much darker in the oil paintings than it is in the miniatures. And I don't take that to be like suddenly he got much darker skinned as he aged, but rather that that's part of the genre of the miniatures is that they tend to focus on the sort of elite white society and to like be crafting a kind of whiteness for people. So, and when they are presenting people of color early on, that they're marking their skin as being flawed somehow. So I would take the sort of lighter skin tone of Sarah and Isaac in their miniatures with a grain of salt to a certain extent of being like a way of presenting themselves as opposed to just like a snapshot in time or something like that. And I think we sort of know that in our own time period that pictures don't necessarily represent exactly how things are because all of us, when we're taking selfies or whatnot, there's 50 of them that and we don't like 49, right? So like we know that things could we're looking for some specific representation, and that's true in miniature making as well.
Thank you. And you mentioned something that I don't know if everybody picked up on, the fact that um, I forgot her name. Sarah. Sarah was actually she was a cute girl and she was had a higher status almost because even though she had some slave blood in her than the Ashkenazi, and the Ashkenazi was actually at a lower level. So I don't know if it'll lead into the next question in a minute.
Yeah, I think of it's a really important thing to remember that um, there a lot of like how people think about Sephardic Ashkenazi relations
Yeah.
today has to do with migration happening 1880s onward and the sort of shift of dynamics of populations within the United States. And that historically, that was just not how things were. That even when there were more Ashkenazi Jews in the early congregations than Sephardic Jews, the synagogue liturgy was Sephardic, and that there was a certain prestige given to Sephardic ancestors. So we know from Mordecai Manuel Noah that he gets asked, are you Ashkenazi or Sephardic? And he has three of his grandparents are Ashkenazi, but he claims that he's Sephardic. And so I think it does give us that insight into like, it's not because he doesn't know that his family's Ashkenazi, right? Like, and that it's just his grandmother who's Sephardic. It's because that's a higher status during this time period.
And so you mentioned now, I knew we'd get into this, the migrations. So there's a question here. Is there information of Sephardi, meaning North African Jews, I'm assuming, from Africa being sent to these synagogues?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. So we know more about um, Eastern Sephardic Jews coming from Ottoman lands. So
Yeah.
that was very common during this time period that we have a number of really famous traveling rabbis that come from Ottoman Eastern Sephardic, traveling around to almost all of the congregations that I mentioned. So, for example, Rabbi Cargill comes to all of them, and
Approximately what years is that?
so also in late like 1760s, 1770s, some
Second half of the
1770s.
1700s, that's what I was.
Exactly. Yeah. And so and he ends up dying in Barbados. So, and we have portraits of him that were done from when he was preaching in Newport, and he gives one of the early sermons in Newport that gets published. And he's clearly depicted as being like sort of exotic, wearing his turban. He has a different kind of hat. It's not a turban, but an Oriental quote style hat. So he's definitely seen as being like somebody who's both has a much greater knowledge than many of the people in the community, but also has a different understanding of Jewishness to a certain extent that's sort of based on Eastern Sephardic lands.
Yeah, but I hadn't heard of North African. So if you,
Yeah, there are some early on. I know that there's some people coming from North Africa into um, the community in London and Amsterdam and
in
uh,
this time period?
during, yeah, and earlier too. And there's, gosh, it's been a long time since I've read Jewish Pirates of the
Sorry.
Caribbean, but I know that he talks a little bit about some of the North African Jews that come into the early Caribbean as well.
I can send that book over for
Yeah.
those who are interested in following
It's
up. That was a
not
very good
like
book.
my favorite book in always, but I think it does have some useful things.
It has some interesting information
It
in
does
it.
have some interesting information. He was a lovely person too. He's passed away at this point. So
Well, thank you very much. I think this was wonderful. I'm sure there will be more questions coming in, so we may follow up with you if that's
sure.
okay. I'll reach out. And I'm wishing everybody the last few days of our Jewish American Heritage Month. Make sure to research, to learn, to follow on Facebook and Instagram and wherever else so that you get some more information. And thank you, Professor Leibman. This was really,
Thank you.
if you want to wait 1 minute, we'll end
Yeah,
the
sure. I was going to say
session.
too, for people who are here, we're going to be doing a couple of different exhibits in on Jews in 1776 next year, different museum exhibits in Philadelphia and New York. So people
Oh,
should keep
so
an eye
how
out
can we
for that.
follow that and how can you,
So I'm sure they'll be getting announced by the beginning of 2026 because they're for the 250th. But definitely might be set for people next year for American Jewish History Month. There'll be an exhibit in Philadelphia at the Weitzman, and there'll be an exhibit at the Jewish Museum as well. So
Okay, so make sure we
and
can
something
help
at
promote it.
AJHS as well. So people should definitely like, if you're interested in Jewish American history, it will be a bonus year for people.
So, Aaron, if you wanted to talk, it
Yeah.
looks like you had your hand up. You can unmute yourself. I don't know, he raised his hand. Maybe it was a mistake. That's why I asked you to wait a minute. Maybe not. Okay.
Hello?
Oh, here.
Brilliant. So, sorry, I'm eating dinner. My question is, was there any evidence of Sephardi Jews coming from West Africa to the Caribbean, especially to Barbados? It's just something that I've heard that I thought, is this reality? What is this?
Yeah. Yeah, so I talk a little bit about that in the book. So there's definitely, I'd say the biggest place that we have evidence of that is from Suriname. So there's a number of the the Maroon communities in Suriname that trace their ancestry back to West Africa. And I
Hmm.
did note that when you look at this is thanks to the descendants who did DNA tests. When you look at the DNA tests from the descendants of Sarah and Isaac, um,
Uh-huh.
and where their ancestry is from, it's from that region in West Africa as well, which doesn't mean that they were also practicing Judaism there, but it I think is at least important to note that some of the people coming into this region definitely historically came in as identifying as Jews. And I don't know if you know who Rabbi Arnold Josiah Ford is. He's really important for one of the
Yes, I do.
congregations in New York. So he is, remember that aunt that I showed that was from the Methodist
Uh-huh.
congregation? His parents, who identify as being from the Sephardic communities in West Africa, come to
Hmm.
that Methodist congregation that Sarah and Isaac's aunt is running. And there's a lot of going back and forth between that and the synagogue, which I talk
Wow.
about in the book as well. So there's definitely people who are like, including like the Hazan of the synagogue is talking a lot with the Methodist minister by the time that he's in charge of it. So I find that super interesting that those two congregations sort of have this exchange going on and
Hmm.
become important players. And then he moves up to New York and is running a congregation there. So very important to me that a lot of those descendants who have both European Sephardic ancestry and people who identify as being from Africa are sort of in that Methodist congregation and bring some of that northward.
That's
If that helps.
really, that's really interesting. I think your work is amazing, and
Oh,
I
thank
think
you.
I think it will help stop radicalization in the Black community because they'll see that they're part of, everybody else, and hopefully, you'll have an impact because I really love it. It's
Oh,
great.
thank you. Yes, I mean, for me, like part of what's been amazing about doing the work has been being able to connect people of those different lines. Like I had written in the
Uh-huh.
book about how I hope that like someday somebody would reach out who was a descendant of the boy who had been enslaved, who I couldn't figure out what his story was, and of the descendants of the people who were from the other women that Abraham Rodriguez Brandon um, had relationships with. And
Mhm.
I think that ability to like, and they did connect with the other people. So that ability of people to whose families were ruptured over time and had lost connections to be able to reconnect, I think is also
Yeah.
super powerful and is it's a good example of how he had only gotten so far in terms of the records that he had, but um, definitely having access to like different um, records and that are hard to access helped sort of piece out like the missing pieces for his part of the family that really were in large ways sort of ruptured by some of what was going on during that time period. So I do think that that loss that happens in terms of family histories is part of what causes some of the like problems and disconnects, as well as the forgetting within family lines. Like the people within the Brandon family of Sarah and Isaac's family by the time of their grandchildren had lost knowledge about what had happened with their grandparents when they were children. So.
Yeah, I apologize, Aaron. I didn't understand that that was the question, and I'm glad you raised your hand so that we had
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, thank you for asking it.
Well, thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for bringing up about the 1776. We need to.
So 1776 coming up. I think we'll see if maybe some of the stuff related to Sarah and Isaac will appear in one of those. We don't know. We'll see if they make the cut for it. But
It's
if they
exciting.
do, people know. I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
You too.